Hey, it's Brooke. I'm back, and it is so good to be here. Many people have asked me to do a recap episode on account of the break. So I did it. I made one. I didn't put it on the feed, though. If you'd like to hear it, you can go to the website, convictedpod.com, and download it for free. It'll be available a little bit later today. If that's what you're waiting for, press pause and go check the website, convictedpod.com. While you're at the website, you'll notice the support tab at the top of the page. That link is in response to the many questions I've gotten on how people can support Richard. His family set up a fund, and I provided a link. None of the money comes to the podcast. Actually, I'm going to make a donation myself. My donation is not a declaration of innocence or guilt. It's much more selfish than that. I'm making my donation because I believe in justice. You should consider that too. If you or someone you know were convicted of a crime, would you get a fair trial? If you didn't, could you afford to fight the system? I couldn't, but I can afford a couple of dollars right now. If you make your donation by August 10th, screenshot it and send me an email with your address, and I'll send you some Convicted swag. This episode has 3 sponsors. Without sponsors, there would be no Convicted. Supporting the sponsors, whether it's financially or on social media, supports us. At the end of this episode, there will be 2 trailers from other podcasts. They aren't sponsors, they aren't paid. It's just me connecting you with great podcasts from regular people like us. Our first sponsor is Stamps.com. I can't tell you how much time they've saved me just this week. So why are you still going to the post office and dealing with their limited hours when you can get postage on demand with Stamps.com? Anything you can do at the post office, you can do right now from your desk with Stamps.com. Buy and print official U.S. postage for any letter or package using your own computer and printer. And, unlike the post office, Stamps.com never closes, so you can get postage whenever you need it, 24/7. This week, I mailed out some new Convicted stickers in a podcast sticker trade. My envelopes and packages were all proudly sporting Stamps.com stamps and labels. If you screenshot your donation, you'll get to see for yourself when I mail you your swag using Stamps.com. I saved so much time, and I didn't even have to leave my house. Right now, use this podcast name, Convicted, for this special offer. A 4-week trial, including postage and a digital scale. Don't wait. Go to Stamps.com before you do anything else. Click on the radio microphone at the top of the homepage and type in Convicted. That's Stamps.com. Enter Convicted. Stamps.com. Never go to the post office again. In episode 5, we talked about the prosecution's case, the evidence that they had against Mr. Nicolas. We talked about their theory that he had wanted to relieve himself of an unwanted financial obligation, that he took his daughter to the mall, bought a ticket for a children's movie, and took a picture in a photo booth. The state's position was that before the movie started at 8 p.m., he took her back out to the car and put her in the front seat while he retrieved his gun. I checked. Sunset on that night wasn't until almost 8:30 p.m. It would have still been light out. It was their theory, though, that he was so stealthy and flexible that he was able to use his non-dominant hand to shoot his 2-year-old daughter in her left eye. I say flexible because she slumped against the center console of the car. It was the place where the receptacle of her seatbelt unfastened and poked out. He then left his baby girl alone and bleeding in the car, according to the state. Even though it was still daylight out for half an hour after the movie started, no one noticed her lying there alone. This was all proven by science, of course, like the fixed lividity in Asia's body after only 2 hours, the 10 particles of GSR on Richard's hand, and his inappropriate response to trauma at the scene as testified to by a gas station attendant and a scared rookie police officer. The defense wasn't buying it. Let's talk about their case. I'm Brooke. Thanks for waiting. This is episode 6 of Convicted. Richard's trial began with jury selection on June 6th. It wasn't until June 18th, 12 days later, that the prosecution rested. Judge Hubbard had mistakenly penciled in a week for the trial, but it was obviously going to take longer than that. She had a vacation planned for the week of June 23rd. If she was going to make it, the defense would only have 2.5 days to present their side. The prosecution had been given more than a week to present their evidence. Judge Hubbard wanted to ask the members of the court and the jurors to put in longer days. None other than Christina Gutierrez fiercely objected. because whatever faults people might attribute to her, she understood human behavior. She knew forcing a jury to sit for longer days only during the defense's side would probably increase any biases that they might have. At the very least, it wouldn't do Richard any favors. Midday on June 18, 1997, the defense began their case. The first to speak was the respectful yet passionate Arthur Cheslock. He asked for an acquittal. The state hadn't proven anything really, and so his client deserved to go home. We know, though, it wasn't granted, and the second half of the trial began. We talked last time about child support payments, or a lack of in this case. It's true. Richard did miss several child support payments. Arthur tells us a bit more.
This is not an unusual thing that when, unfortunately, the father and the mother have an argument and the mother will deny the father visitation and the father may cut it off for a period of time. And I think, but that was all straightened out.
Let's talk for a minute about the testimony of Ms. Tremper, the support officer from the Baltimore County Division of Child Support. She had managed the case between Asia's parents in regard to child support. She described her duties to monitor and enforce child support orders that had been issued by the court. According to Ms. Tremper, as of June of 1995, Richard was current with his child support payments. Asia was born in January of 1994. He'd filled out the paperwork to have the payments automatically deducted from his payroll at American Ambulance. His employment there was verified by the Child Support Office. Remember, Richard had two jobs. One was American Ambulance, and the other was at CopyFix. He was paid bi-weekly at the ambulance company, but his child support order stated that he needed to make payments weekly. On June 27, 1995, Ms. Tremper took matters into her own hand. The bi-weekly yet current state of Richard's child support was no longer sufficient. What did she do? She faxed American Ambulance and told them to stop paying. In her testimony, she said, quote, "The only thing that I can tell you is that I looked at the payment record. I made the decision to terminate at that point because we weren't receiving them weekly, the payments weekly." She had discovered that Richard had another job and was setting out to receive the payments from them. The thing is, she didn't tell anyone, not Richard, not Asia's mother, not even the other job. Ms. Tremper waited until October 6th to send a fax to CopyFix, the other job. 4 days later, 4 days after the fax was sent, Richard gave consent and payments began again. One could argue that Richard should have noticed that the money wasn't being deducted. One could say that he should have made the effort to make it right. He didn't, though. Yeah, it seems irresponsible. But does that make him a killer? While we're talking about finances, I want to mention the life insurance policy. In a completely ironic situation, just days after I talked to Richard for the first time, a brochure for the Gerber Grow Up Plan found its way into my mailbox. Gerber, like the baby food company. The one with the black and white chubby cheek baby logo. The one that we trust our children's dietary needs to throughout their infancy. They created the plan and it was marketed to parents. It looks like a good deal. It's cheap, it's easy, and it's a plan to help your child in the future. I just read the face page of the Gerber Grow Up Plan website. Do you know how many times it mentions the possibility of your child dying? 0. Not one. There was another life insurance policy on Asia. It was held by her mother. It was a policy on Asia in which she was the sole beneficiary. That's what parents do. They plan for the worst, yet hope for the best. I wish I could remember who it was, but several weeks ago, someone tweeted to me, "Convicted as the worst commercial ever for the Gerber Grow Up Plan." Maybe that person was right, but the very fact that the Gerber Grow Up Plan exists and has existed for so many years is because people are buying it. Does the Gerber Grow Up Plan make someone a murderer? Let's talk about behavior for a second, about the human response to trauma. How should a traumatized person act? There's no right answer to that. The human brain's response to trauma can affect a person's behavior in a multitude of ways. Labeling someone's reaction as appropriate or not can't even begin to be applied in this situation. Being calm in the face of tragedy does not mean someone is a murderer. People ask me, why didn't he save her? Why didn't he stay with her? I don't know. I wasn't there. I will never be able to understand what was happening in Richard's head that night. I do know that an instructor of the EMT courses that Richard took testified that the first thing one should do in an emergency situation is to secure the scene and then summon appropriate help. I've also been asked many times, why did he wait for Officer Hannah? Why didn't he run back to his daughter? He was on the phone with 911 for 2 to 4 minutes. Officer Hannah responded to the call within 15 and 25 seconds. I'm not so great at math, but it seems to me like Officer Hannah would have already been outside waiting when Richard left the building. Why did he park on the wrong side of the road? I've been there, in that exact spot on Bowley's Lane. I know it was the right spot because I took the crime scene photos with me. The side of the road that Richard did park on has several feet of grass before a row of trees marking the perimeter of the cemetery. The other side of the road doesn't even have a shoulder. It's lined with a guardrail, I imagine to keep people from rolling off the edge onto the interstate below. If one were to park on that side of the road, they would effectively be stopping in the middle of the lane. I've never been called for jury duty, and I imagine it's a hard job. But it seems to me like this jury might have been struggling more than most. In the last episode, we talked about sleeping jurors and audience members gesturing to jurors. In the episode before that, we talked about jury members being selected who never confirmed that they could be impartial. At one point, on June 18th, there's a bench conference near the end of the day. The players in the trial are trying to determine if they should go on or go home. Cristina Gutierrez says, "We're tired, Judge." Mr. Carden says, "I know there's one juror sleeping." The judge asks him which juror, and he says it was juror number 6, and he even goes on to identify when that particular juror was sleeping. The judge then makes the determination to take one more witness before ending the day. Near the end of the trial, his protector, his little sister Mary, made another observation about the jury.
Even during the trial, we pointed out to the judge that the jurors were actually speaking to my niece's family. They were consoling them during the breaks, and we would take that to the judge. I'm seeing it with my own eyes. The policemen were having relationships with the family members. There was one that had developed a sexual relationship with one of the family members, and nobody saw an issue with that. It was like there was so much that went on. It was just insane. I still don't understand how this was all tolerated. Even when we brought it to the attention, basically, when I saw in the hallway some of the jurors hugging my niece's family, I reported to the judge.
I read this in the transcript.
Right. And she basically said, made comments that just, she didn't remove those jurors. Right. I'm thinking, well, shit, I've just damned us all. I told on you, nothing happened. But to me, that was crazy. That should have been a problem right there.
In the transcript, the judge has Mary point out the jurors she's referring to, and they're questioned. They deny any involvement with anyone, and so Mary's concerned are pushed aside. The court makes a snide comment about not starting on time. Mary returns to the hallway. She wanted to be there to support her brother, to let him know that his family was there for him. She was testifying, though, and wasn't allowed to stay in the courtroom. Next episode is going to be a breakdown of the sciences. We'll compare and contrast between experts and the way things were done then compared to now. In this episode, we're going to talk about the gist of the experts' testimonies. The defense hired an actual, literal rocket scientist. Upon reading this expert's qualifications, I was transported back in time to my childhood. I was reliving all the dad jokes about something not being rocket science. The point is that rocket scientists tend to be, figuratively at least, the exemplification of brilliance in our society. They're seen as smart. This particular rocket scientist was also an expert at failure analysis. Basically, he figured out why things fail. He was particularly experienced in the area of automobiles. His name was Dr. Chisholm, and his testimony was related to the reported road rage and bumper collision incident. I'm not going to pretend that I understood everything he referred to in his many-page testimony, but I did understand that he was certain that the bumper of Richard's Cavalier had been bumped by another car. It's time for our second sponsor break. Blake and I were talking just the other day about how much we love our Movement watches. And we talked about how the company is kind of like us. It was two broke college kids that wanted to wear stylish watches, but they couldn't afford them. So they started their own watch company. Not only for their own style and convenience, but also because they wanted people like us to be able to afford stylish watches also. Movement watches start at $95. At a department store, you're looking at $400 to $500. Movement figured out that by selling online, they were able to cut out the middleman and retail markup, providing the best possible price. The classic design, quality construction, and styled minimalism has equaled a big success because they've sold over 1 million watches in over 160 countries. Get 15% off today with free shipping and free returns by going to mvmt.com/convicted. This watch has a really clean design. Seriously, I've been getting compliments ever since I put it on. Now it's time to step up your watch game. Go to movement.com/convicted. Join the movement. I found it interesting in this case that all of the witnesses were sequestered. They weren't able to be in the courtroom with one exception: the experts. In this case, the defense's experts were able to listen to the prosecution's experts in order to be familiar with their opinions when it was their turn to testify. The defense called their own gunshot residue expert to testify about the findings in this case. If you remember back, there were 10 particles found on Richard's left, non-dominant hand. The defense's expert was asked if he agreed or disagreed with the state's expert about several statements in his testimony. The state expert said that finding GSR on a person's hand meant there was a high probability that they had discharged a gun. The defense's expert disagreed. He stated that, quote, "There's no way one can make that kind of conclusion." The defense's expert also stated that transfer was possible from touching a piece of furniture like a car door or a dash, or by touching a person who had been shot. The gist of the statement was basically that there's no way to tell where those 10 particles from Richard's non-dominant hand came from. Could he have been the shooter? Yeah. Could he not have? That's just as likely. I'll have a lot more information for you next time, but here's a preview. I talked with someone who works in the field of GSR. They asked not to be identified, and I'm respecting that. Their information was immensely helpful and helped me to understand the current standards in place. I had attached significance to the number of particles on Richard's hand. I didn't think there were enough, but it turns out that's not even the important part, especially when the testing was delayed. I have to wonder if GSR isn't comparable to cat hair. When I have direct contact with my cat, like petting her, more often than not, I end up with cat hair on my hand. But let's be honest, it's summer. There's cat hair everywhere at my house. So if I pet my cat, grab my jacket, and put on my shoes, and then find a cat hair on my hand, I don't know where it came from. It was equally as likely to have come from any of those sources. When investigating GSR, there are two different types of particles. There are particles with 3 parts and others with 2 parts. 3-part particles have all the ingredients to be gunshot residue, but 2-part particles are missing one. The thing about 2-part particles is that they exist in abundance in our environment. For example, when coming into contact with a copy machine. The test that was done on the particles found on Richard's hand only tested for 2 of the 3 particles. That means we only know that there were at least 2 of the 3 ingredients for gunshot residue present in the particles on Richard's hand: barium and antimony. This is a quote from the person I talked to who does GSR testing after reviewing some information that I shared. In current standards, I would never call a barium antimony particle a GSR particle. It's a particle consistent with gunshot residue, meaning it could have originated from a firearm discharge, but there are numerous other sources. It's possible that there were 3 component particles present, but since that's not what he was looking for to begin with, who knows? It equates in my head as someone declaring that a sandwich is peanut butter and jelly, but really only checking for peanut butter and bread. It looks like the full sandwich, but how can we ever be sure? We can just say it might have been peanut butter and jelly. It might not have. Who knows? The defense called another expert, and I'm going to tell you what he said, but know that the validity of this kind of evidence is disputed. He talked on the matter of blood spatter analysis, basically how the bloodstains help piece together the details of the crime. His testimony was that Asia had been looking out the window when she was shot and had not been fully seated. The exact angle she was facing, he couldn't tell. Her body had slumped on the left side of the seat where the seatbelt and emergency brake were located. Next time you sit in the driver's seat of your car, try this. Find a position in which you can use your left hand to propel the person next to you towards the center of the car by means of contact with their left eye. Additionally, realize that the bullet was level with the eye. It didn't go up or down. It made a partial exit, a small hole in the back of Asia's head. I'm going to give my opinion here, so if you're not into that, you might want to fast forward 30 seconds or so. I like to challenge people, and I appreciate when people do the same to me. I think it helps reduce bias. When people ask me why someone would have shot Asia and not Richard, I propose this scenario. A 2-year-old girl is sleeping in the front seat of a car when her dad parks and gets out. She's jostled, though, by a sound, or maybe a car door closing, and is startled, so she pops up and maybe gets to her knees to see better. She looks out her window towards the commotion. Someone else is out there. Her window's rolled up about 2 inches, so not much more than her face is showing above it. What if the person out there got scared? Maybe they were under the influence of something. Maybe not. They saw the large man get out of his car, but they didn't even know there was a passenger. Frightened and on the defensive anyway, they shoot into the car. Because they're both in cars, and despite personal height differences, they're level, and the bullet goes straight through. The small figure who'd been angled to look out the window slumps to the center of the car. I'll be right back after our final sponsor break. It's been so busy here in the recording closet lately that I've decided I need to reach out and get some help. So I turned to ZipRecruiter to make sure that I could find the person to help me and the podcast. With ZipRecruiter, you can post your job to 100+ sites with just one click. Then, their powerful technology efficiently matches the right people to your job better than anyone else. That's why ZipRecruiter is different. Unlike other job sites, ZipRecruiter doesn't depend on candidates finding you. It finds them. In fact, over 80% of jobs posted on ZipRecruiter gets qualified candidates in just 24 hours. No juggling emails or calls to your office. Simply screen, rate, and manage candidates all in one place with ZipRecruiter's easy-to-use dashboard. Find out today why ZipRecruiter has been used by businesses of all sizes to find the most qualified job candidates with immediate results. And right now, my listeners can post jobs on ZipRecruiter for free. That's right, free. Just go to ZipRecruiter.com/convicted. That's ZipRecruiter.com/convicted. One more time, to try it for free, go to ZipRecruiter.com/convicted. A multitude of character witnesses were called, family, friends, coworkers, and they all talked about how proud Richard was to be a father and how much he loved his little girl. The prosecution had paraded Richard's gun collecting in front of the jury, so in rebuttal, the defense called several of his gun-owning friends to the stand. Every friend that had reported buying guns from Richard had immaculate paperwork and receipts. There were no unaccounted-for guns, and the guns that Richard still owned couldn't have possibly been the murder weapon. Speaking of the murder weapon, there isn't one in evidence. The police searched a wide radius around the crime scene for a gun. They even used dogs, but they didn't find one. It wasn't found at the movie theater. As a matter of fact, if Richard committed the crime, he hid the gun very well, because to this day, it's never been recovered. The last person to take the stand in the case of Richard Nicolas was Richard Nicolas, a man who had struggled his entire life with being misinterpreted because of his speech disorder. He took the stand in front of the jury that had been instructed to use his speech and mannerisms to determine his credibility. That takes guts.
I think that his speech impediment hurt him tremendously. Even to us, when we would meet with him, had trouble conveying what he was trying to say. I think that's probably the biggest issue that came up. I don't know how to explain it, but when he was testifying, when he would talk, he would say something and then realize that it wasn't coming out the way he wanted it to. And that definitely happened during his testimony in court. You see, if a defendant testifies and the jury doesn't believe him, it doesn't matter what else there is. There may be no evidence against the person.
I agree with Howard's statement. I mean, really, is it so hard to believe that people who don't even know you would judge you based on how you speak, how your words come out? Because you have little pauses between words sometimes so you can think and breathe? I mean, I guess if you're struggling with this concept, you probably haven't read the reviews for this podcast or any other woman's podcast. Sometimes people are so stuck on how a person talks, they don't listen to what they're saying. Richard spent a day and a half on the witness stand. He talked for many hours in a row, answering questions, knowing the rest of his life depended on what he said. The first question posed to him by his own attorney, Ms. Gutierrez, was, quote, "Mr. Nicolas, did you kill your daughter?" He answered, "No, ma'am." She brings up his stuttering. He says he's stuttered for his entire life. She asks how it affects his ability to communicate, and he says, "It gets worse when I'm nervous or upset." He's not ashamed, though. It's just the way he was made. A little later, Miss Gutierrez introduces a note from the speech pathologist that treated Richard as a child. My friend TJ is going to read it for you to break up my voice a bit. Not that I think anyone would judge me based on how I sound.
Richard Nicolas, age 8, was seen in the Speech and Hearing Section, Department of Rehabilitation Medicine, on July 3, 1973, for a speech reevaluation. He has been seen previously in the department for stuttering therapy. Richard and his mother provided the following information. Miss Nicolas said that she thinks Richard's speech is very good now, especially since the vacation has begun and he's subjected to less pressure. He did very well in school this past year and will be entering the 3rd grade in the fall. He has several close friends with whom he likes to play. He attributes his difficulties during school to his friend Michael, who looks at him face to face. He doesn't see Michael in the summer. Richard usually looked at the wall while he was talking. Visual contact appeared to be rather difficult for him to establish while engaged in fluent speech. His rate of speech is slow and gives the impression of being monitored. During 35 minutes of conversational speech, Richard's speech was fluid with only 6 initial sound prolongations, 1 part-time word repetition, and 2 phrase repetitions being noted. Occasional sound distortions were noted. Samples of both oral reading and spontaneous speech were taped of his speech during this time was fluent. Miss Nicolas was counseled regarding her attitude toward Richard's fluency. It was suggested that she be more outwardly positive in her attitude towards Richard's speech. Because of Richard's present level of fluency, speech therapy at this time is not recommended. Miss Nicolas will contact us if any further speech difficulties should arise.
As a former child therapist, a couple of red flags stand out to me in the letter. I would need more information to form any solid opinion, though. She asked him about his history working on an ambulance, and he explained that he had always been on the low end. When he was asked exactly what that meant, he said that he had always worked for private ambulance companies, the kind that mostly handle transports. He'd never been to the site of an emergency. He'd never handled a shooting. He talked about also working at Copyfix and how he had bounced between the 2 jobs and finally ended up working at both simultaneously. When he asked about child support, he said that he had requested that it go through the courts because, quote, "that's how they did it." I've known Richard for a while now, and in my opinion, he's a routine, follow the instruction kind of person. So that's not really that hard for me to believe. He addressed the issue of child support payments and pretty much said the same thing as the worker from the child support office. He had had payments deducted from his check, but they stopped being withheld and he didn't correct it until he was contacted several months later. The defense asked him about the night Asia was killed. He tells the story. He picked up Asia, they went to the movie theater and found out the movie had changed. He said that they went window shopping and took a picture in the photo booth. He said they shared a large drink and some popcorn as he and Asia watched the movie together. She was sitting on his lap. They left the theater at 9:45 or whenever the movie was over and went to the car. He said that he took the exact way home that he had taken to get to the mall. But this time, a car came up behind him. He didn't recognize whoever it was, but he went to high alert when they bumped his car. Ms. Gutierrez asked Richard why he pulled off onto Boley's Lane, and he said that he had turned off the main road because he hoped the other car would stay on the main road and keep going away from him. Why did he pull over? Why didn't he keep going? He said he didn't know where he was, so he pulled over and got out of the car to confront the other driver. He said the car pulled up next to his and he heard a gunshot go off. He looked in the car and saw Asia slumped over in the seat, and he saw a wound on her face. He panicked, and the only thing he could think to do was get help. They talk about the 911 call, and he says that he alone took Asia out of the car under the orders of Officer Hannah. He's asked about his interrogation. He was questioned by police for 26 hours before he was ultimately arrested. He's then handed over to Miss May for cross-examination. Sharon May was a very skilled prosecutor. I recently watched her speak on a docuseries on Netflix. I imagine she was really effective. She took Richard down all the avenues she could think of to destroy his character, to make him unlikable to the jury. She talked to him about suggesting an abortion, which he denied. She asked about child support. She asked about gun collecting. She asked about his reasons for wanting to take his daughter to the movies. She asked about the Gerber grow-up plan. She asked him at what point he cried. Is that mandatory? He didn't cry, so he must have killed her? After 12 days of trial, both sides had concluded their case. I think it's at this point I'm going to mention the witness that wasn't called. Last time I introduced Dr. Shute, the medical examiner. His testimony was that lividity was fixed in Asia's body at the scene, and that lividity being fixed means that she'd been dead for 2 hours. Just so you know, that's not accurate, not even close. It wasn't challenged, though. No questions were asked to dispute those facts. No rebuttal witnesses were called. Nothing.
It was very important. And the testimony had two problems, of course, as you saw. The first was the doctor who got down there, not the doctor, the person who picked up the body said that the body was fresh. There was no lividity at the time. And I remember when we left the courtroom after the doctor testified, I asked Howard. Howard said that he had a friend who was a doctor, an expert, and he would check with his associate, the doctor. And he came back and he said that he couldn't do anything. The doctor said he couldn't do anything.
So they didn't do anything. Before the closing arguments are presented, the judge instructs the jury on how to proceed, what they can and cannot do, and what they must and must not take into consideration to ensure a fair trial is had. Sharon A.H. May is the first to give her closing arguments on June 25, 1997. She brings up the life insurance policy, the particles that could be consistent with gunshot residue. She lingers, though, on the issue of lividity. It's been undisputed. No one on the defense's team seemed to understand the weight that claim would hold. It was almost as if an unimpeachable source had informed her of as much. Her argument is brief and to the point. Science says he did this. He's guilty. Cristina Gutierrez took a bit longer for her closing. The police didn't properly investigate. He testified even though that was long and difficult for him. She said it was unfair to chastise him for not crying. He'd been trained to get help first, and that was what kicked in. The state didn't even have an expert look at the car to see if he could be telling the truth. Ms. Gutierrez said the thought that Richard and Officer Hannah both reached through the window to remove Asia was, in a word, absurd. She mentions that Dr. Shute had not formally issued a time of death and that he stated temperature was an indicator of the time. He then says that Dr. Shute had no idea what happened to Asia in the 15 hours between when she died and when he performed the autopsy. Sharon May gets one last chance in front of the jury before they start their deliberations. And she says, quote, I honestly thought there would be no answer from Ms. Gutierrez on the issue of lividity, but the answer I got was even better. Ms. Gutierrez stands up here today and tells you he didn't say what he said he said. A little later, she adds, Dr. Shute said you need 2 hours for lividity to set up. Let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, there's not enough time. There's not enough time in this scenario that this defendant has put forth for all of these things to have happened. And that's it. The jury goes into deliberations at 12:55 p.m. They've been at the trial for 13 business days, away from their jobs, away from their families, and unable to talk about it with anyone. The jury deliberates until 3:34 p.m. It was about 2.5 hours for them to discuss, process, and return with a verdict. Richard Nicolas stood, though only one attorney was standing with him, Arthur Cheslock. With one word, the foreman of the jury changed the life of Richard Nicolas and those close to him forever. Guilty.
It was and is a continuing horrible case. Richard's innocent, and that's something that it's hard to live with, but it is something you do. I don't know where everything goes, except, if you're successful, you'll be doing something great. I didn't think that Richard had a fair trial in the city. I think that I can't second guess people. But I think that it has plagued the case, and they've constantly played a trump card with regard to the attorneys. And you ask yourself what you did wrong, and that's something or what another attorney did wrong, or what another expert did wrong. And it's something that I'm always asking. Because he never killed Asia, never killed her.
I am fortunate that I can't imagine the feelings that were experienced in that moment. Mary shared with me what her experience was like after the trial.
And the day that he was convicted, I remember leaving the courthouse, and Greg Stoddard, this little short news reporter, ran up to me and put the camera and the mic in my face, and he said, hey Mary, so what does it feel? How does it feel to know that your brother's a murderer? And I remember saying something to the effect of, I don't know, Greg. How would you feel if someone that you loved dearly was wrongly convicted and you got some little bastard with a microphone in your face? So I thought they feel pretty shitty right now, Greg. And so he cut the camera off and called me some name and went on about his business. And this woman stepped out of the shadows and spit on me. She spit on my clothes, right in the middle of my blouse.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, like a hawk spit. And I'm like, I just remember seeing it come at me and looking at myself and looking at her. And she said that I was the devil's spawn, and that my brother and I would get our just dues. It was crazy. It was like I didn't even know who this person was, but.
Remember the fund, and don't forget to screenshot your donation before August 10th for a convicted surprise. One more thing. My buddy James Wyrick and I from the Military Justice Podcast are going to be sharing a table at Podcast Movement next month. Be sure to check out his podcast, Military Justice. I hope to see you there. I'm Brooke. Thanks so much for listening. You can see pictures, download the transcripts, and view other documents at convictedpod.com. Convicted is hosted and produced by me with music and scoring by musical genius Blake Maples. You can see and hear his work at blakemaples.com. Additional help was received from TJ Cunahan. If you like what you hear, please give us a rating and review on your podcast app. And be sure to subscribe so you're the first to hear the next episode of Convicted.
So knowing that we can't change the past, what do you think is the best case scenario for the future? What would you like to see happen?
To my brother to get a fair trial, and just a fair trial. He was convicted by his peers who had no clue about the law. With the jury trial, juries have become smarter over the years. So 22 years ago when my brother had his trial, you show someone some god-awful pictures and you hit the heartstrings, they're going to side with whoever. And, they had jurors come up and say at the end that they basically convicted my brother because he liked to play with guns, which made no sense.
Imagine being accused of a horrible crime that you know you didn't commit. That's in episode 1. Imagine your child's killer is still on the loose, but the authorities keep saying they don't suspect foul play. That's in episode 4. Or imagine that you've spent 17 years in prison, only to then be fully exonerated due to advances in science. That's episode 10. My name is Jillian, and my podcast is Court Junkie, where I cover criminal trials and court cases and conduct interviews with those close to the case. Check out Court Junkie, available now everywhere you listen to podcasts.
This is Esther, host of Once Upon a Crime, a podcast that shares true crime stories chapter by chapter. Crimes are covered within series like, we're in the series Monstrous Moms and Dastardly Dads. This is Chapter 2, John List. Killer Kids. Chapter 1, Jesse Pomeroy. Murder in Paradise. Chapter 3, Missing in Aruba. This is Chapter 1, A Woman Scorned, Betty Broderick. As a storyteller, I share not only the details of the crime, but also my research into the backgrounds of the victims and perpetrators to try to understand why events unfolded as they did and to offer clues into how and why these crimes occurred. You can find more about the show on truecrimepodcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts.